Lieutenant Sarah Chen had always known she was different from the other officers aboard the USS Valiant. At 28, she was one of the youngest helicopter pilots in the Navy, and certainly one of the few women flying combat missions in the Persian Gulf. Her small frame and quiet demeanor often made senior officers underestimate her, but those who flew with her knew better. The morning sun cast long shadows across the carrier deck as Sarah performed her pre-flight inspection. Her hands moved with practiced precision over every bolt, wire, and instrument panel of her MH-60R Seahawk helicopter. This wasn't just routine maintenance. It was ritual, meditation, and survival, all wrapped into one careful process that had kept her alive through 47 combat missions. "Chen!" The voice cut through the sound of jet engines and deck crew chatter. Sarah turned to see Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez jogging toward her, his face grim. "Admiral's calling an emergency briefing. All helicopter pilots." Now, Sarah's stomach tightened. Emergency briefings usually meant one thing. Someone wasn't coming home. She secured her checklist and followed Rodriguez toward the briefing room, her mind racing through possibilities. Had intelligence picked up new threats? Were they being reassigned? The questions multiplied with each step. The briefing room buzzed with tension as 15 helicopter pilots filled the metal chairs. Admiral James Whitmore entered with his usual commanding presence, his weathered face showing the strain of command in hostile waters. Behind him walked Captain Patricia Wells, the ship's intelligence officer, carrying a thick folder of classified documents. "Ladies and gentlemen," Admiral Whitmore began, his voice carrying the weight of difficult news. 3 hours ago, we received a distress signal from a reconnaissance team operating 40 miles inside enemy territory. 6 Marines are trapped behind enemy lines after their transport was shot down during what should have been a routine extraction mission. The room fell silent except for the constant hum of the ship's engines. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. She knew what was coming next. Captain Wells stepped forward, spreading aerial photographs across the briefing table. "The team is holding position in a small village, surrounded by hostile forces. They have limited ammunition and no heavy weapons. Intelligence suggests enemy reinforcements will arrive within 6 hours. After that, extraction becomes impossible." Admiral Whitmore's eyes swept across the room, studying each pilot's face. "This is a volunteer mission only. The risks are significant. We're talking about flying into heavily defended airspace with minimal air support. Multiple surface-to-air missile sites have been identified in the area. The enemy knows we're coming." Sarah studied the photographs, her pilot's mind automatically calculating flight paths, fuel consumption, and tactical approaches. The landing zone was a nightmare. A small clearing surrounded by buildings that could hide dozens of armed insurgents. The approach would require flying through a valley where helicopters would be sitting ducks for anyone with a rocket-propelled grenade. "The mission requires a 2-helicopter team," the Admiral continued. "One for extraction, one for air support. We need pilots with extensive combat experience and proven ability to operate under extreme pressure." "Who volunteers?" Hands began rising around the room. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison was first, a veteran with over 200 combat hours. Major David Park followed. Then, Lieutenant Tony Vasquez. Sarah watched as 7 pilots volunteered for what everyone knew was likely a one-way mission. Admiral Whitmore nodded approvingly at the volunteers, then his gaze stopped on Sarah. She hadn't raised her hand, not because she didn't want to volunteer, but because she was still studying the mission parameters, calculating odds, thinking through alternatives that might increase the chances of success. "Chen," the Admiral said, his tone carrying a hint of challenge. "Not volunteering. I would have thought a pilot with your supposed skills would jump at the chance for some real action." The room's atmosphere shifted instantly. Sarah felt every pair of eyes turn toward her, some curious, others uncomfortable with the Admiral's obvious provocation. She recognized the test for what it was, another senior officer questioning whether she belonged in combat operations. "Sir," Sarah replied evenly. "I'm analyzing the tactical situation to determine the optimal approach. Volunteering without a solid plan Gets people killed. Admiral Whitmore's eyebrows rose slightly. Is that so? Well then, Lieutenant, perhaps you could share your analysis with those of us who've been planning combat operations since before you were born. The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Sarah stood slowly, her mind racing, but her voice steady. She had faced this kind of skepticism before. The assumption that her youth and gender made her less capable, less committed, less worthy of respect. The primary issue isn't the enemy defenses, she said, walking to the map display. It's the terrain and timing. Flying straight into that valley gives the enemy multiple opportunities to engage us with small arms and RPGs. But if we approach from the north, using this ridgeline for cover, we can minimize exposure time. She traced a route on the map with her finger. More importantly, the enemy expects us to attempt extraction during daylight, when our air superiority is most effective. They've positioned their defenses accordingly, but their night vision capabilities are limited. If we wait until dusk and use thermal imaging, we can approach with significantly less risk. Interesting theory, Admiral Whitmore said, his tone suggesting he found it anything but interesting. But those Marines don't have until dusk. Intelligence indicates enemy reinforcements will arrive well before then. Sarah met his gaze directly. Sir, with respect, intelligence estimates have been wrong before. If we rush in during daylight and lose both helicopters, those Marines die anyway. If we take time to plan properly and execute at dusk, we increase everyone's chances of survival. The Admiral stepped closer, close enough that Sarah could see the skepticism in his gray eyes. Tell me, Lieutenant Chen, how many enemies have you actually killed in combat? The question landed like a physical blow. Sarah felt the room's energy shift again, this time toward uncomfortable silence. She knew what the Admiral was really asking. Whether she had the killer instinct, the willingness to take lives that he believed defined a true combat pilot. It was a question that revealed more about the questioner than the questioned. A challenge rooted in old assumptions about what made someone dangerous in combat. Sarah had heard variations of it before, always from officers who measured worth by body counts rather than mission success. For a moment, she considered giving him the answer he expected. A deflection, an excuse, or perhaps an admission that would confirm his suspicions about her capabilities. Instead, she chose something far more dangerous. The truth. Sir, that's not the question you should be asking. Admiral Whitmore's face darkened. Excuse me? The question isn't how many people I've killed, Sarah said, her voice calm, but carrying absolute conviction. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, could sense the mixture of admiration and concern from her fellow pilots. She had just challenged a flag officer in front of his subordinates, something that could end her career with a single word. But she wasn't finished. In 47 combat missions, I've extracted 83 wounded personnel from hostile areas. I've provided close air support that allowed ground units to complete their objectives without casualties. I've delivered supplies to cut-off units and evacuated civilians from combat zones. My helicopter has never failed to complete a mission, and every person I've been sent to rescue has come home alive. Admiral Whitmore's expression was unreadable, but Sarah could see something shifting behind his eyes. She pressed on, knowing this moment would define not just this mission, but her entire military career. You want to know about my kill count, Admiral? Here it is. 0 Marines lost under my protection. 0 Navy personnel abandoned in hostile territory. 0 missions failed due to pilot error or lack of courage. That's my kill count. The number of people who are alive today because I did my job. The room remained silent. But the quality of the silence had changed. Where moments before there had been tension and skepticism, now there was something else. Recognition. Perhaps even respect. Sarah took a breath and continued, her voice steady. If you want someone to fly into that valley and spray bullets at anything that moves, choose someone else. But if you want someone who will bring those Marines home alive, regardless of the cost, then you want me on this mission." Admiral Whitmore studied her for a long moment, his weathered face revealing nothing. The other pilots remained frozen, unsure whether they had just witnessed career suicide or something entirely different. Finally, the Admiral spoke, his voice quieter than before. "And you believe your approach gives us the best chance of mission success?" "Yes, sir. I do. Even if it means waiting while those Marines remain under fire?" "Sir, those Marines are trained professionals holding a defensive position. They can maintain their position until dusk if they know help is coming. But if we lose our helicopters in a poorly planned daylight assault, they'll die anyway, along with our air crews." Admiral Whitmore walked back to the front of the room, his hands clasped behind his back. For 30 seconds, that felt like 30 minutes. He said nothing. The only sounds were the ship's engines and the distant noise of flight operations above. When he finally turned back to face the room, his expression had changed completely. "Chen, you'll lead the mission. Morrison, you're her wingman. I want a detailed flight plan on my desk in 2 hours, including all contingencies and abort procedures. Captain Wells will provide updated intelligence on enemy positions and strength." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror wash over her. She had won the argument, but now she had to prove her theories were correct with real lives on the line. "Sir," she said, "I recommend we also coordinate with air support to create a diversion on the eastern approach. If we can draw their attention away from our actual route, it increases our chances significantly." Admiral Whitmore nodded slowly. "Make it happen." Dismissed. As the other pilots filed out of the briefing room, Admiral Whitmore gestured for Sarah to remain behind. She stood at attention, unsure whether she was about to receive commendation or court-martial. "Chen," the Admiral said when they were alone, "that was either the most impressive display of tactical thinking I've seen in years, or the most elaborate way of getting yourself killed. I hope for everyone's sake it's the former. Sir, I understand the risks, but I believe this approach gives us the best chance of success." "I hope you're right, Lieutenant, because if you're wrong, those Marines die, and so do you and Morrison. That's a hell of a burden to carry." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Sir, with respect, that's a burden I carry on every mission. The only difference is that this time, someone asked me to explain my reasoning." Admiral Whitmore studied her for another moment, then nodded once. 2 hours, Chen. Don't make me regret this decision." As Sarah left the briefing room, her mind was already racing through the details of mission planning. She had 6 hours to prepare for what could be the most important flight of her career, and quite possibly the last flight of her life. The next 4 hours passed in a blur of intense preparation. Sarah's small quarters aboard the USS Valiant had been transformed into a tactical planning center, with maps, satellite photos, and technical specifications covering every available surface. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison sat across from her, occasionally offering input, but mostly watching in fascination as she worked through countless scenarios. "You know," Morrison said, sipping his third cup of coffee, "in 15 years of combat flying, I've never seen anyone plan a mission quite like this." Sarah looked up from the weather charts she was studying. "How do you mean?" "Most pilots plan for success and hope for the best. You're planning for everything that could possibly go wrong and figuring out how to succeed anyway." Sarah smiled grimly. "That's because I've seen what happens when everything goes wrong. In my second year of flight training, I watched a rescue mission turn into a disaster because no one planned for the helicopter's weight limitations. After picking up casualties, 3 good Marines died that day because the pilot hadn't considered that wounded men weigh more than healthy ones." She returned to the charts, calculating fuel consumption under various combat scenarios. "Morrison, what's the maximum weight we can carry and still maintain combat maneuverability?" "Depends on fuel load and weather conditions. In current conditions, maybe 8 fully equipped Marines plus crew. The intel says 6 Marines, but that was 3 hours ago. If any local civilians got caught in the fighting, they might have taken them in for protection. We need to plan for possible additional evacuees. Morrison nodded appreciatively. Good thinking. What about ammunition? If we're going in at dusk, we'll need flares for illumination. Already calculated. We'll carry extra flares. But I'm hoping we won't need them. The thermal imaging should give us sufficient visibility without advertising our position. We are Prof. A knock at the door interrupted their planning session. Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez entered, carrying a secure communication device. Lieutenant Chen, Admiral wants you on secure comms. Priority traffic. Said. Priority traffic. Sarah took the device, entering her authorization code. The screen flickered to life, showing Admiral Whitmore in the ship's communications center. Chen, we've received updated intelligence on the situation. The news isn't good. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. What's the situation? Sir? Enemy reinforcements arrived 2 hours earlier than predicted. Our Marines are now facing significantly increased pressure. They've had to fall back to a secondary position, which means the original landing zone is compromised. On the screen, Admiral Whitmore held up new satellite photographs. The good news is that their new position is actually more defensible. The bad news is that it's in an area with no suitable landing zones. Extraction will require hover operations in an area surrounded by buildings that could conceal hostile forces. Sarah studied the images, her mind immediately shifting to analyze the new tactical situation. Hover extractions were among the most dangerous operations a pilot could attempt. Holding a helicopter stationary while under potential fire required split-second timing and absolute precision. Sir, what's the timeline for enemy reinforcements to reach the new position? Intelligence estimates 3 hours, possibly less. Sarah glanced at her watch. That would put enemy reinforcements at the Marine position just as darkness fell. Exactly when she had planned to begin the mission. Admiral, I need to modify our approach. The timing is now critical. We can't wait for full darkness, but we also can't go in during broad daylight. We know too. Live how catter. We can't wait for 5. What do you propose? Twilight extraction. We go in during the last 30 minutes of daylight, when visibility is reduced, but not completely eliminated. It's riskier than my original plan, but it's our only option if we want to reach those Marines before they're overrun. Admiral Whitmore was quiet for a moment. Chen, twilight operations are incredibly dangerous. Depth perception is compromised, and if anything goes wrong, you won't have enough light for emergency procedures. Sir, if we wait any longer, there won't be anyone left to rescue. Morrison leaned forward to look at the new photographs. Admiral, the lieutenant's right. That position won't hold against a full assault. If we're going to do this, it has to be now. Very well, Admiral Whitmore said finally. But I'm moving up your departure time. Wheels up in 90 minutes. Can you be ready? Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with controlled fear. 90 minutes to finalize plans, brief the crew, and prepare for what could be the most dangerous mission of her career. Yes, sir. We'll be ready. 10. Chen. The Admiral's voice carried a note of something she hadn't heard before. Concern that seemed almost personal. That exchange we had earlier in the briefing room. I want you to know it wasn't personal. I needed to know if you had the confidence to stand by your convictions under pressure. Sarah was surprised by the admission. Sir, in 32 years of military service, I've learned that the most dangerous person in a combat zone isn't the one who's killed the most enemies. It's the one who's too afraid to make the hard decisions when lives are on the line. What you showed me today was that you're willing to take responsibility for your decisions, even when challenged by superior officers. Sir, I was just doing my job. No, Chen, you were doing what leaders do. There's a difference. The communication ended, leaving Sarah staring at a blank screen. Morrison whistled softly. Well, that was unexpected. I don't think I've ever heard the Admiral admit to testing someone like that. Sarah was already moving. gathering the mission plans and equipment checklists. We can analyze command psychology later. Right now, we have Marines who need to come home. The next hour passed in intensive final preparations. Sarah and Morrison briefed their crew chiefs on the modified mission parameters, went over emergency procedures, and conducted final equipment checks. The two Seahawk helicopters gleamed under the hangar deck lights, their weapons systems loaded and ready. As they prepared to move the aircraft to the flight deck, Sarah noticed a crowd of personnel gathering near the hangar entrance. Word had spread through the ship about the mission, and dozens of sailors and Marines had come to see them off. It wasn't unusual, but something about this gathering felt different. Chief Rodriguez appeared at her elbow. "Lieutenant, the crew wants to say something before you launch." A senior Marine sergeant stepped forward from the crowd. "Ma'am, we just wanted you to know that some of us served with those Marines who are trapped. They're good men. Bring them home." Similar voices echoed from the crowd. Sailors and Marines who had served with the trapped reconnaissance team, friends and shipmates who understood what it meant to leave no one behind. Sarah felt the weight of their trust and expectations settle on her shoulders. "We'll bring them home," she said simply, and meant every word. As the helicopters were moved to the flight deck, Sarah performed her final pre-flight inspection. Her hands moved automatically through the familiar routine, but her mind was focused on the mission ahead. Weather conditions were deteriorating, with increasing winds that would make hover operations even more challenging. Intelligence reported increased enemy radio traffic, suggesting they knew American forces were coming. Morrison's voice crackled through her helmet radio as they started their engines. "You ready for this, Chen?" "As ready as anyone can be for what we're about to do. You know, after today, your reputation on this ship is going to be very different." Sarah allowed herself a small smile as she watched the deck crew give the signal for takeoff. "Let's just focus on making sure we have a reputation to worry about tomorrow." The Seahawks lifted off from the carrier deck in perfect formation, their rotors beating against the darkening sky. Below them, the Persian Gulf stretched endlessly in all directions, but ahead lay hostile territory, and 6 Marines who were counting on them to defy the odds one more time. As they flew toward the coastline, Sarah checked her watch. They had 47 minutes until full darkness, and 38 minutes until estimated enemy reinforcement arrival. The margin for error had shrunk to almost nothing. But she felt a calm confidence settle over her. This was what she had trained for, what she had been preparing for her entire career. "Morrison, remember, we go in fast, we get them out fast, and we don't take any unnecessary risks. Those Marines have been holding their position for hours. They'll be ready for us." "Crime. Copy that. And Chen, for what it's worth, I think you're right about that kill count question." The Admiral was asking the wrong question entirely. Sarah didn't reply immediately, focusing instead on the terrain features that were becoming visible ahead. The coastline was approaching rapidly, and beyond it lay 40 miles of hostile territory, 6 trapped Marines, and the most important test of her career. "Morrison," she finally said, "let's go prove him wrong about what makes someone dangerous." The 2 helicopters crossed into hostile airspace as the sun began its final descent toward the horizon, carrying with them the hopes of everyone who understood that sometimes the most dangerous thing a person could do was choose to save lives rather than take them. The landscape below shifted from the blue waters of the Persian Gulf to the brown and tan patchwork of hostile territory. Sarah Chen maintained radio silence as her Seahawk helicopter flew in perfect formation with Morrison's aircraft, both machines staying low to avoid radar detection. The sun hung like an orange disk on the horizon, casting long shadows that would provide both concealment and danger in the minutes ahead. 28 minutes to full darkness. 21 minutes until enemy reinforcements were expected to reach the trapped Marines. Through her helmet's communication system, Sarah heard the steady breathing of her crew chief, Petty Officer 2nd Class David Kim, and her door gunner, Petty Officer 1st Class Maria Santos. Both were veterans with hundreds of combat hours, but she could sense the tension that always preceded a high-risk mission. "Contact ahead," Morrison's voice crackled through her headset. "Village structures visible 2 miles northeast." Sarah adjusted her night vision equipment and confirmed the sighting. The village appeared exactly as described in the intelligence briefings. A cluster of single-story buildings arranged around a small, central square, with narrow streets that would funnel enemy forces into predictable positions. But it also meant limited escape routes and multiple hiding places for hostile fighters. Chen to Morrison, I'm picking up radio chatter on enemy frequencies. They know we're coming. Copy that. Still no visual on the Marine position. Sarah switched to the emergency frequency used by ground forces. Recon 1. This is Angel Flight. Do you copy? Static filled her helmet for several seconds before a voice responded, tense but controlled. Angel Flight. This is Recon 1 Actual. We have been waiting for you. What's your ETA? Recon 1. We are approximately 8 minutes from your position. What's your current status? Angel Flight. We have 6 Marines, ambulatory. 2 with minor wounds. We've taken fire from multiple positions around the village perimeter. Enemy strength estimated at 20 to 30 fighters with small arms and at least 2 RPG teams. Sarah's mind quickly processed the tactical situation. 2 wounded Marines would slow down the extraction. And the enemy numbers were higher than originally estimated. The margin for error had just gotten even smaller. Recon 1, can you mark your position with infrared strobe? Negative. Angel Flight. We lost our IR strobes in the initial contact. But we're in the building with the blue door on the north side of the main square. There's a small courtyard behind us that might work for extraction. Sarah pulled up the satellite imagery on her navigation display and located the building. The courtyard was barely large enough for a helicopter to hover, surrounded by walls that would create dangerous downdrafts and limit maneuvering room. Morrison, are you seeing this landing zone? I see it. Chen, that's going to be tight, even for an experienced pilot. Sarah studied the approach routes, calculating angles and distances. We're going to need to come in from the west, using that row of buildings for cover. You provide overwatch from the south while I go in for extraction. What if you take fire during the hover? It was a question every helicopter pilot dreaded, because there was no good answer. A helicopter in hover was essentially a stationary target, dependent on its crew and escort for protection. Then you light up anything that moves, and I get us out of there as fast as possible. 5 minutes out from the target area, Sarah could see muzzle flashes in the distance. Sporadic small arms fire as enemy forces probed the Marine defensive position. The trapped reconnaissance team was still fighting, which meant they were still alive and still had ammunition. Angel Flight. This is Recon 1. Enemy contact from the east side is increasing. We may not be able to hold this position much longer. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Recon 1. Hold your position. We are 3 minutes out. She switched back to her tactical frequency. Morrison, we're going in now. Weather's deteriorating, and those Marines are running out of time. Copy. Chen, you know this is beyond dangerous, right? Hover extraction in an unsecured LZ with hostile forces in close proximity. This is the kind of mission they use in pilot training as an example of what not to do. Sarah allowed herself a tight smile. Then I guess it's good that I wasn't paying attention during that particular lecture. 2 minutes from the target, Sarah began her final approach. She could see the village clearly now, with several buildings showing damage from the ongoing firefight. Smoke drifted from what appeared to be a burning vehicle on the eastern edge of the settlement. Recon 1. Angel Flight beginning final approach from the west. Pop smoke to mark your position. Angel Flight. Popping smoke now. A yellow smoke grenade detonated in the small courtyard behind the building with the blue door, confirming the Marine position. Sarah could also see muzzle flashes from several buildings around the village perimeter. Enemy fighters were in position and ready to engage. Morrison, I count at least 6 different firing positions around the village. This is going to get interesting. I'm tracking multiple heat signatures on thermal. Chen, there are more hostiles than intelligence estimated. Sarah began her approach to the courtyard. The Seahawk descending through the last few hundred feet of altitude. The sun had set completely now, leaving only the faint glow of twilight to provide natural illumination. Her thermal imaging showed the heat signatures of the 6 Marines crouched behind makeshift defensive positions in the courtyard. At 50 feet above the landing zone, enemy fire erupted from multiple positions. Tracer rounds streaked past the helicopter's windscreen as Sarah fought to maintain control during the descent. The distinctive crack of AK-47 rifles mixed with the deeper sound of machine gun fire. "Taking fire from the north," Santos shouted over the intercom as she returned fire with the helicopter's mounted machine gun. Sarah continued the descent, her hands steady on the controls despite the chaos erupting around them. At 30 feet, an RPG streaked past the aircraft's tail rotor, missing by less than 10 feet, before detonating against a nearby building wall. "Christ!" Kim called out. "That was close." Morrison: "I need suppression fire on the northeast building. I'm seeing multiple muzzle flashes from that position." Morrison's Seahawk swept around the village perimeter, its guns blazing as it engaged the enemy positions. But more fighters seemed to emerge from every building, turning the extraction into a running gun battle. At 15 feet above the courtyard, Sarah felt the helicopter shudder as small arms fire struck the aircraft's armored belly. Warning lights flickered on her instrument panel, but nothing critical had been hit. "Recon 1, get ready to move. We're coming in hot." The Marines in the courtyard had already broken from their defensive positions and were running toward the helicopter's landing zone. Sarah could see that 2 of them were indeed wounded, moving slower than their teammates but still mobile. 10 feet above the ground, Sarah felt the helicopter buck as the rotor wash created turbulence against the surrounding walls. This was always the most dangerous part of any extraction, the moment when the aircraft was low enough to be hit by small arms fire, but not yet on the ground. "Contact right," Santos called out, her machine gun chattering as she engaged enemy fighters who had moved to within 50 meters of the courtyard. Sarah touched down in the small courtyard with inches to spare on either side of her rotor disc. The Marines ran toward the helicopter in practiced formation, with the 2 wounded men supported by their teammates. "Loading now," Kim shouted as he helped pull the first Marine into the aircraft. Enemy fire intensified as hostile fighters realized the Americans were attempting extraction. Bullets sparked off the helicopter's armored hull and shattered the windows of surrounding buildings. Sarah kept the aircraft at idle power, ready to take off the instant her crew chief gave the all-clear signal. "5 in," Kim called out. 6 in. "All personnel aboard. Go, go, go." Sarah pulled power and lifted off from the courtyard just as an RPG detonated in the space they had occupied seconds before. The Seahawk climbed rapidly, banking hard to the left to avoid additional rocket fire. "Morrison, all Marines aboard, and we're clearing the area." "Copy that, Chen. You've got 2 heat seekers inbound from the north." Sarah looked at her threat warning display and saw the approaching missiles. Heat-seeking missiles were designed to home in on aircraft engine exhaust. Exactly what her helicopter was producing as she climbed away from the village. Deploying countermeasures, Sarah triggered the aircraft's defensive flare system, sending dozens of burning magnesium flares streaming behind the helicopter to confuse the incoming missiles. At the same time, she pushed the Seahawk into a violent, evasive maneuver, diving toward the ground while turning hard to the right. The first missile exploded harmlessly among the flares, but the second continued tracking the helicopter's heat signature. Sarah watched on her display as the weapon closed the distance, knowing she had perhaps seconds before impact. "Hang on," she called to her crew and passengers as she pulled the helicopter into an even more aggressive maneuver. The missile passed less than 30 feet from the aircraft before its proximity fuse detonated, sending shrapnel through the air around them. Sarah felt the Seahawk shudder as several pieces struck the tail boom, but the aircraft continued flying. "Damage report," she called to her crew chief. Kim quickly inspected the passenger cabin and rear of the aircraft. Multiple minor hits to the tail section, but nothing critical. All Marines are secure and accounted for. Sarah allowed herself a moment of relief as they cleared hostile airspace and began the flight back to the carrier. In the passenger compartment, Navy corpsmen were already treating the wounded Marines, who would be fully cared for within the hour. Morrison: "How? Copy. Right behind you, Chen. That was some of the finest flying I've ever seen. Just doing the job, Morrison." As they flew back over the Persian Gulf, Sarah reflected on the mission. 6 Marines were alive and heading home to their families. Her crew had performed flawlessly, under extreme pressure. The mission parameters she had insisted upon, even though they had ultimately been modified due to changing circumstances, had provided the foundation for success. 45 minutes later, Sarah guided her damaged Seahawk onto the carrier deck of the USS Valiant. As the aircraft's engines wound down, she saw Admiral Whitmore waiting near the landing area, along with medical personnel and what appeared to be half the ship's crew. As Sarah climbed out of her helicopter, Admiral Whitmore approached. His expression was serious, but she could see something else in his eyes. Respect. Perhaps even admiration. "Chen," he said, loud enough for nearby personnel to hear. "That was exceptional work out there. Mission accomplished with all personnel accounted for. Thank you, sir. My crew performed admirably under difficult circumstances." Admiral Whitmore studied her for a moment, then spoke more quietly. "Earlier today, you told me that my question about kill counts was the wrong question. You said the right question was how many people you've saved." "Yes, sir." "Well, Lieutenant, you can add 6 more to that count. And I owe you an apology. You were absolutely right. I was asking the wrong question entirely." Sarah felt a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying begin to lift from her shoulders. "Sir, you were testing my conviction under pressure. I understand why that was necessary, perhaps, but what I learned today is that the most dangerous person in a combat zone isn't necessarily the one with the highest kill count. It's the one who's willing to risk everything to ensure that everyone comes home. That's a different kind of dangerous. The kind that makes the enemy afraid and our own people confident." Admiral Whitmore extended his hand. "Outstanding work, Lieutenant Chen. The Navy needs more officers like you." As Sarah shook the Admiral's hand, she could hear cheers erupting from the gathered crew members. The Marines they had rescued were being helped toward the medical bay, where they would receive treatment before being reunited with their units. Later that evening, as Sarah completed her post-mission paperwork, she received a message that would change everything. Admiral Whitmore had recommended her for the Distinguished Flying Cross and immediate promotion to Lieutenant Commander. More importantly, he had requested her assignment to the Navy's Elite Rescue Unit, where her skills and philosophy would be put to use training the next generation of combat pilots. The message included a personal note from the Admiral. "Today, you proved that the most important question isn't how many enemies a warrior has killed, but how many friends they've brought home, alive. The Navy needs leaders who understand that distinction." Sarah smiled as she filed her mission report. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new missions, and new opportunities to prove that sometimes the most dangerous thing a person could do was choose to save lives rather than take them. She had found her answer to the Admiral's question, and more importantly, she had found her place in the Navy as a leader who understood that true strength came not from the ability to destroy, but from the willingness to protect. 6 Marines would see their families again because someone had been willing to challenge conventional thinking and risk everything for the principle that no one gets left behind. That, Sarah reflected, was a kill count worth celebrating.